first speaker and introduce Pat Edmondson, Josh Moore, and Michelle Moore. These are three licensed mental health counselors that have been serving the Clark County area for decades at this point. So I just wanted to take a minute and say thank you for your service, because what you do, you guys have been stewarding something that we as pastors don't always get to touch. And that's really the hearts of people and your safety in that and your connection with them. We just want to honor that today. It's kind of the unsung heroes in the region. So I just want to say thank you for that. Pat, you have a special place in my heart, and I have no problem, sharing this with other people, but you were actually one of the first counselors that I ever met for myself, and you changed my life. So I just want to say thank you for stewarding my heart, and I couldn't do this, I would not be here had it not been for you and what you poured into me. So, and I know that that's how you serve everybody. I'm not special, but you're special to me. So I can't do this without honoring you, is what I'm trying to say. So thank you for, creating room for me so that I can serve people the way that I'm called to serve them. Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and pray. But I want to just really quickly communicate our heart for this workshop class conference. I really was impressed by the Lord today that the area of mental health has kind of been like the women with the issue of blood. It's the issue we don't want to touch as the church. It's the issue that we're going to put her out in the world and let her fend for herself and go to all the doctors and all of the therapists, but we don't want to talk about it as the church, right? But when we do that, we actually refuse to partner with God to bring healing to a region. And so my heart for putting this on, just being the one little person that I am, is really to just agree with God in what he's doing through counselors, through therapists, through doctors, through physicians in the area of mental health, okay? So we're going to be talking about a lot of stuff. It's going to be really, really, really good. I would encourage you to keep your heart open. Allow the Lord to minister to you in areas where maybe you've bumped up against some pain. Pain with him, pain with God, pain with therapists, whatever that is, there's going to be healing for that during this time. So I'm going to go ahead and open in prayer. Thank you, Holy Spirit. Father, I thank you for every single person that's in this room today. I thank you that you care about them. You care about their hearts. You care about their journey. You care about their story. So, Father, I ask that you would come and you would meet with them exactly where they are. Whatever their need is, whether it's physical, emotional, spiritual, all of the above. I ask that you would remove every stronghold in the mind that's been built up against your kindness. In the areas where you want to move in your kindness on their behalf, whether that be through a counselor, a doctor, a therapist, whoever that is, inner healing, deliverance, whatever that looks like. God, I ask that you would move in your kindness. Lord, we thank you that you're going to be removing shame from the conversation today in mental health. We thank you for the restoration that's coming, and we just agree with your goodness on their behalf in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Joshua Moore. Joshua, you want to go ahead and come on up? Okay. So do you want to introduce your credentials? Because there's a lot of them, and I'm probably not going to remember all.
My name's Joshua Moore. I'm a licensed mental health therapist in Vancouver, Washington. We own a small neurotherapy clinic where we do emerging clinical modalities that most of you have probably never heard of. But we have a lot of fun, and we're mostly looking for what are the newest things that have the most potential to help the most amount of people, and then trying to figure out how to make those affordable and to offer new hope where people have been trying for far too long to get help. My background, I have a theology degree from Multnomah University, which I would call my first love, studying theology. Yes, there you go, we got one. Studying theology is something that is no less complex than trying to study the human brain, and that's what makes it so enjoyable for me. Is the indefinite complexity that we're never going to get to the bottom of it. And then my second phase of my life, I spent time in the military as an orthopedic specialist and a combat medic, where I did the life flights at Walter Reed and did the mass casualty triage. So I have an immense amount of short-term, but very, very packed-in experience around physical trauma and pain. Michelle and I also did a medical clinic in Haiti at one point, about a year after the earthquake, where I did a trauma clinic. I think we saw an average of 200 patients a day or more, very fast. And then so now currently I'm a mental health therapist, and I'm board certified in neurofeedback, which is a specialty of neuromodulation where we're trying to coax the nervous system into different balances using techniques like operant conditioning and many other techniques. So, but we'll talk about that maybe afterwards. If you want to come by the booth or something like that, you can ask me questions about that. Lots and lots of stuff about that. So I've been asked to talk today about integrations, mental health integrations. And I thought that I saw something a few days ago, like maybe 2 days ago. This popped up on my computer screen. John MacArthur, who maybe all of you have heard of in one way or the other, said that there is no such thing as PTSD, OCD, or ADHD, and suggested that all they really need is Jesus. And I hate that I'm paraphrasing him. I did intentionally avoid listening to the whole context so that I could view him as generously as possible, just in case it was a really, really bad intended statement. But you've probably heard things like this, I'm guessing. And some of you, if we're being honest, some of you may even agree with it. And that can be okay to a degree because we can talk about where mental health is flawed and why. But this can also mean lots of things that can be really painful and hurtful to people who are suffering greatly. And it can be very invalidating. And it can be disorienting to others who will try to look for help and fail to get the appropriate help that they need. And we'll look a little bit more at that. But what do you guys think that this might mean? Do you have any thoughts on this? You can just pop out answers. It's okay. He doesn't have all the information. Maybe he's missing some data. Maybe he's lacking some exposure to a certain kind of suffering in his own life. I don't know him personally. Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, denies the physiological side. Yeah. Does he feel this way about hospitals? It's a fair question, isn't it? Does he? Because what if there are physiological issues that are driving emotional pain? What if you could measure PTSD? Do you think you can? Absolutely you can. I can image it. I know exactly what it looks like in the brain. And it's, if you think you have it, you always do, which is the terrifying part. Yeah, that's a question I would ask him if I sat down with coffee is, do you feel this way about hospitals? And if you don't, it starts to get gray. How do you find the line? And because I haven't looked at the full context, maybe this isn't as bad as it sounds. But it might be. It might be as bad as it sounds. Let's see. So what we're going to go over is we're going to go over terms, which is really important to go over. What do we mean when we mean real? So mental health isn't real. What does that mean exactly? We have to break that down sometimes. And then we're going to go over the body-mind connection and the mind-body connection. So how does the body, as you said, how does the body affect the mind? What if there's a physical cause to something and it's causing something that looks mental? Is that not real, John MacArthur? Can the mind directly, in a measurable way, significantly affect the body? And then we know it would be measurable, right? Okay, well, we'll look at that as well. And then the spirit. What do we do with the spirit? And if we're going to ask the question, what's real, how do you know the spirit's real? And we can look at that. That'll be a fun one. That's probably my favorite part of the discussion. So here we are. As Christians, this should be potentially one of the ways that we would view the whole self. And there's room for debate in this, and I'm not going to get caught up in the weeds. Like, is the mind a construct between the body and the spirit, or is the mind its own separate thing? We're not really going to cover that today, but I think it's its own thing because it behaves separate. And we'll talk about that key piece of it behaves as something real in the world. And we're going to keep coming back to that phrase for a reason, and we're going to bring statistics into it, okay? So, how do we judge what is real? And normally we'd have them kind of slide in piece by piece, but that didn't kind of work well with the email translation. How do we know the parameters, like an artist would outline the difference between different spaces, how do we outline and separate and know what is real? Things of matter. The body, there's this objective perspective. I can sense it, I can feel it. I have a sense of it. It feels hard. It's got matter, right? Other people, property. We start to go down the list a little bit. What about money? Is money real? I mean, it's like physical, right? But then there's parts of it that aren't. It's getting kind of weird. And then what about debt? Is debt real? You see, Pat's like, definitely real. Now we have to come up with a good definition of what real means, okay? And that's why I use this phrase, does it behave in the world as something real? Does it have this interaction and this impact that forces you to contend with it? It must be contended with. You have to wrestle with it. And maybe that's a fair definition for our purposes of what we're going to call real, okay? Is that something we can agree on? And I'm actually open to critiquing that right now before we move forward, if there's any other brighter thoughts than that, which happens, by the way. So let's go a little further and look a little bit further. So what about the things that aren't matter, but the things that do matter? Like family, kinship, time, hope, intimacy, love. Are these things demanding to be contended with in the real world? Do they have measurable, articulable results with definitions, the way an artist would separate different objects in a painting? They do. And which one's more important if we were to actually try to form a hierarchy on some of these? Which more important, your family or your property? Which one's more real to you? Okay, so are the things of matter less real than the things that matter? Is that possible? I think it is possible. That's a little bit like, that the physical matter in the world is less real to us as Christians than the things that matter. There are things more real than the matter in the world. And that might be why our language is formed in such a way. There's lots and lots of things like that in language that clue us into maybe some interesting, deeper meaning, which I think is fascinating. The intangible is often more important than the tangible. So body health, generally accepted. We kind of went over this. It's got parameters, it's measurable, it's got biomarkers. Let's look at the mind. How do we define the mind? How do you know it's real? Again, it's going to force you to contend with it. We're going to probably skip ahead because I have like 30 slides, and I could probably spend 5 slides on an hour. But let's look at the mind in a minute. First, we'll also think a little bit, the spirit. Is it measurable? Does it have different qualities? Does it interact with the world as though it's something real? We'll look at these in pieces. Does the body affect the mind? This one's pretty easy. I think some of you immediately jumped up on this because maybe we've all had experience with this, but traumatic brain injury seems to very viscerally, clearly affect the mind. And I'm speaking as somebody who did the life flights at Walter Reed, which means that if somebody stepped on a bomb, they got patched by a medic, and the medic flew them to me. And then I decided who got treatment and who didn't get treatment to triage resources. And I decided who to focus on first. And it wasn't always the most injured person that we'd focus on first, because you had to decide who was worth your time and who needed care the most, who could benefit from your care the most, which is something sad that I only had to do a few times, sadly. Organic disorders. There's things like dementia, there's disease, there's neurotransmitter imbalances, and that's what's... Thyroid problems. Oh, goodness. Andrea could probably talk for an hour on thyroid disorders. I know there was some recent study done where they did different hormone cocktails to see how it affected people's moods. And it was a qualitative study, meaning they were really looking closely at people's interpersonal experiences about that. And everyone said that it was crushing how much control chemistry had over their mind. It was almost a wake-up call. I thought I had more control over myself. I thought that I had more to me in terms of fortitude than just chemistry. It's like, ooh, it can really make you weak. It can really make you lean on God. So we can kind of tell from just common sense that there's a significant interplay between the body and the mind, that we actually can observe these as being, maybe you might say, fully integrated, so that I am something like a physical person, and that's an explanation for all of me, but I'm also like a mental mind, and that is an explanation for all of me, and yet they're still separate. So we are all of you is a mind, and all of you is physical. And so, we're going to have to see, does the spirit actually match that? That would be an interesting question. Let's go a little bit further on this body-mind connection, though. Has anybody heard of ACE scores? So a couple people. So ACE scores was a study done about 1997 by Kaiser Permanente, and I have some nice insight into this study, which was about a 17,000 person initial study. It was actually Henry Kaiser, who's actually a personal friend of ours, who sent the first study out and got it going. And so I have some personal insight into the development of it, which was really great. They asked 10 questions, which you can actually look at these yourself if you want. 10 questions about emotional abuse, physical abuse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the amount of yeses that you had, which was yes to this negative experience around household illness, separation, divorce, incarcerated family members. And if you said yes, then you got a point. And what they were looking at, does this correlate with like things in life? What does it correlate with? What are the boundaries of this kind of mental health or this mind effect on people's existence? And the experience or the data that came in was a little bit alarming because it was so much more pervasive than you'd expect. We were talking about, you can read some of these yourself, but a 4,000 or 400% increase in hepatitis for 4 more scores. Just having one ACE score doubled your chances of being an alcoholic. Suicide went up by 1,200% if you had an ACE score of 4 or higher. And this is just one study. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of studies. And what they're struggling to find is any boundaries where it doesn't increase negative things. Because they found studies on cancer. Yeah, if you have a higher ACE score, you're more likely to get cancer, you're more likely to have heart disease, you're more likely to, if you witness domestic violence, you're 2,000 times more likely to commit it as an adult. It's a problem, 2,000 times. Not 2,000%, 2,000 times more likely to commit it. Here's a breakdown of the population. 36% of the population has none. And it goes up pretty dramatically from there. 26% have 1, 16% have 2, 3 scores are 9.5% of the population, and 12.5% of the population has 4 or more. And the 4 or more research is where things get kind of rough. We don't see that population coming out very consistently of some of those negative statistics. They have super high rates of domestic violence, alcoholism, addiction, mental health trauma, low recidivism rates in counseling, and high rates of suicide, et cetera. And again, we're struggling to find the limits of what that's going to affect. Now, if you think about this from this integrative self, where it's like all of me is physical and all of me is mental, there aren't going to be any. And so, of course, they started looking at, well, what about COVID long haulers? Are they more likely to get COVID long haulers if they, had more ACE scores? And the answer was yes. It just keeps going and going. And so we can research this indefinitely. At some point, we have to accept that it affects every single part of your life. There is a little bit of hope, And that is, there's something that they found, I think it was in 2019, so not long ago, something called counter ACEs. And counter ACEs showed that if you had positive supports in your life, and some of the questions revolved around things like, there was one person you could always talk to about anything. And I don't know all the questions. It doesn't really give everything away in the study that I found, unfortunately. But there are resources in your life that gave you the option of pulling out. And so you became that statistical outlier. So as clean as the study was, it got even darker if you didn't have any ACE scores, and it got really, really bright if you did. There was some problems in that that success in pulling out of that risk factor decreased if you had 4 or more. So they seem to have, between the physical and the mental, we seem to have a limit to how much we can modulate, and we'll talk about that before the end. As Christians, we should have more answers. We're not going to come up with all the answers on earth, and we're not supposed to. So, this is something that I think I wanted to cover real quickly. It's a little bit of a weird topic, but I wanted us to contemplate just a little bit about what emotions even are. You could say, well, emotions are these things that everybody experiences, and maybe we can find people who have those in common, and maybe they're more the same than they are different, and that's probably not true. Unfortunately, that's probably not actually how emotions work. There's a book that is very heady. I loved it, but I'm a little bit of a weird guy. How We Make Emotions by Lisa Barrett. If you're really into technical reads, you can give it a try. But Lisa Barrett, she found that there was no template for emotion, that when you say anxiety, there's no evidence that anybody else in the room actually meant that sensation. And I could explain it technically, and it would probably be a little bit annoying and going over your head, but I'll give a story instead that she actually puts in her book. She was researching emotions, and she thought, I'm not having a good work-life balance, so I'm going to go and get a dating app, and I'm going to go get at some relationships and just kind of live a little bit of life and not be so in the lab, which is a true story. This is what she did. She got a date. She sat down with this guy, and for the first half hour, she thought, oh my goodness, he is just as boring as a box of rocks. I can't stand this. I can't wait for it to be over. And then she started noticing after a little while, there was a little flutter in her stomach, and she thought, well, maybe he's a little interesting. This is starting to pick up a little bit. And at the end of the date, he said, would you like to go out again? And she said, yeah, I think I'd like that. And then she went home and threw up for 3 days because she actually had the flu. Okay? So it's like, wait, what happened there? So what a great moment for someone who's researching emotions, right? This is going to be the formation of a book. So the flutter in her stomach, she had a history of understanding what that meant, and that history was that it must be chemistry. And from that history, she had a particular constructed experience, which we call an emotion. And again, it's on the back of the history. It's on the back of the association of what that was historically to her. And that had affected her perception and her decisions. And of course, she went on a date with him after she got better from the flu, and she was bored the whole time. He was not interesting. She did not go on a third date. And so that's problematic. If when you say you have depression, that's not necessarily the same thing that I'm experiencing when I think I'm depressed. And that when you say you're depressed, you have a particular somatosensory experience, that's what we call it. There's something in your body that you feel, and through the history and paired association of what was happening in the history of experiencing that sensation, you have constructed meaning out of that, and you give it a name. But there's no evidence that that's the same with me. And that's concerning. It's a little bit weird. So we're not really in each other's heads. We have this illusion that we kind of get it. And that also kind of helps us understand, things that act in the real world as real. When I say I know what you're going through, that doesn't seem to do anything useful. And maybe that's because it's not true. That maybe it's disorienting because it's actually not true. And if there is a little bit of an illusion that maybe we're connecting over something, it isn't really what gets people better. Which is a little bit of a relief as a therapist. Oh, I don't have to suffer the same way that my clients suffer. I don't have to understand people to help them, which is really nice. And we might come back to that, which is why I threw this slide in. It's a really, really technical thing about emotions, but it might come up as useful. That your experience is just yours. Yeah. All right, switching gears a little bit. Oh, so we do see that mental health work does work generally as a general rule. After 8 sessions, only 50% of patients experience significant relief. It's like, okay, well, talking about your problems to somebody who doesn't really get it does seem to result in positive effects. 6 months, you see the benefits go up to about 75%, and you see those measured in things like sleep and happiness and empowerment, mental function, productivity. And so people are becoming more oriented, which is helping them form better interventions for the world and those interventions are yielding a higher degree of success than before, and they're producing these positive outcomes. It's like, okay, that's what being oriented means, is we have better beliefs that lead to better decisions. Those decisions lead to interventions that are higher rate of success, and then we're doing better. Great. That's what oriented means, which is important to remember. But there is room for some criticism in mental health. And this comes on the back of the discussion around emotions and experiences. There's problems with the diagnostic model because, again, what's in our head and what's in our experience is just ours. I would actually say that in mental health, we don't really go as far as evaluating the organ that we are trying to treat. And that's a weird thought. You think, well, what about hospitals? Like, hospitals have diagnostic models. We use the same word diagnosis in mental health that we do in hospital health. But if I go to the hospital and I have a rash, they're not going to diagnose me with a rash. This is where we can be a little generous towards John MacArthur. Maybe he might be onto something. Maybe if we're really, really, really generous, you know, really, really generous, maybe we could see, maybe it's hard to get there. But I don't get diagnosed with a rash when I go to a doctor with a rash. I get diagnosed with whatever's causing the rash. So it's going to be like road rash, it's going to be an infection, it's going to be an immune issue, it's going to be virus, it's going to be bacteria, it's going to be cancer, it's going to be 100 things. But they're going to figure out what's causing it, and I'm going to get diagnosed with whatever's causing it. But I'm not going to get diagnosed with rash just because I present with rash. But don't be fooled. In mental health, we kind of do that. Mental health diagnostics, which is the same word, which is not helpful because it's disorienting. You come in with anxiety, and they're going to diagnose you with anxiety. Great. Well, that's not very useful because it doesn't tell you why at all, and your experience is just your own. So whatever projection the therapist has, that's not that useful either. Okay. If you have depression, they're going to diagnose you with a form of depression. And now there are things in mental health that are mechanism specific, with a degree of error, but there aren't a lot of like prescriptive diagnostics within mental health. Diagnostics in mental health are descriptive, not prescriptive. And so it's almost like maybe we need a different word. And I'm not going to start that revolution, it's not going to happen. But we kind of do need a different word for it. We're talking about people who are suffering, and we're describing it, but we're not getting down to the why. And that could be because the large system doesn't know. And yet therapists are still somewhat successful, which is fascinating. The human-to-human interaction can be the solution with a 50 to 75% degree of success within 8 weeks to 6 months. That's kind of interesting for not even knowing what we're doing. And there's conflicting data on what we think we even know about PTSD. I'll give an idea of that. And again, this is giving John MacArthur a little bit of credit, more than he deserves, I'll admit. How many people that were within, say, a half a mile of the World Trade Centers falling in New York during 9/11, how many people who were close enough to feel the heat off the building, the shock waves, watching people jump to their deaths, they could hear it and see it, how many of those people within that radius got PTSD? What percentage would you guess? And this slide kind of betrays it because it skips ahead. A lot of people say all of it. The reality is that it's 5 to 15%, and it correlated with people who already had ACE scores above 4 and probably already had PTSD. So that flies in the face of what we think we understand PTSD to be. Well, like in the military, we put the PTSD clinics in with the concussion patients. Like they had the same department. It was like, well, PTSD is this neuronal, firing, it's overstimulated and it burns out, and so we're going to put them with the concussion patients, But during 9/11, no background increase for PTSD at all. So what were the difference? What do you think the differences were? There was a response. There were no secrets. You were allowed to have your emotions, right? Yeah. People weren't hiding it. And there was just a kind of something in the air that you could feel. It was supportive. If somebody was crying in the grocery store, no one was, stigmatized by that. Maybe you would come up and support them. It was fine. It was fine. There was a time where everything was okay, and people were allowed to have their feelings, and they were allowed to have their experience, and they could be vulnerable, and that vulnerability was allowed to turn into intimacy. We're not that vulnerable anymore. So, we still don't have a good definition for trauma. But it's something like the internalization or failure of internalization of the meaning of events and the subsequent identity crisis. It's something like that. But that's not a formal definition that you're going to hear anywhere else, because the formal definitions that you're going to see in graduate schools don't really work technically. Let's look at the body-mind now. Same topic, 9/11, okay? There was a unit of firefighters that got out of the World Trade Center before it collapsed and survived. And they gave them pretty much every service that you could give. And they had a lot of friends that died. It was very, very traumatic in many ways. And they had the survivor's guilt. And they were the group that you would expect to get PTSD, even from maybe a more integrated model. And when they were interviewed after 2 years and said, what made the biggest difference in your recovery? They'd had everything. They were given everything you can imagine. And their answer was massage therapy. Anybody have any insights into that? I'm still trying to work that one out personally. There's like a massage therapist in here that knows. What's that? Physical connection, physical touch, physical connection, physical release. That our emotions are built on the back of what? It's physical experience with a history of association. And so it was physical that made the biggest difference for them. Okay, so trauma is physical? Yes, it's physical and it's mental, and it's 100% of both. Okay, you can't separate them. You can't. They're both. That's a little bit disturbing, that we are all physical and we are all mental. So, emotions are largely constructed, but they act in the world as something real. Perception can dictate and interpret sensation. So how we interpret the experience that we're having is going to inform our perception, which is going to inform our behavior. And that's mostly context of association, of how we've had that feeling across time. And again, A scores, which is a snapshot of our history, will dictate how we're going to experience that, whether positive or negative. And this is actually maybe worth mentioning in that my field, we do scans of people's brainwaves. We do that a lot, like tons and tons of it, and I love it. It's so much fun because it's cheap relative to like lots of other ways to scan the brain, and it's tons and tons of data. And what we found at one point was that people who were self-made millionaires and people who were afraid to leave their house had the same brain balance. And the difference was their ACE scores. Yeah. So one person has a sensation in their body, which is derived from a brain balance, and from the context of their childhood, they withdraw. And the other one has a sensation that's from the balance of their brain, and from the context of their childhood, they advance and push and fight and go after something. It's all context. It's a little bit disturbing. So let's talk about the spirit. And where are we at in time, by the way? Yeah, oh, really? Tons of time. We might want to slow down even. I'm intentionally rushing through this in fear. And this is a kind of room, I bet we could get some great discussions going with this room, by the way. So feel free to interrupt if you have any questions or thoughts. And yeah, go ahead, please. Such a good question. And that's where I mentioned at the beginning that I'm not necessarily going to tear all this apart and try to nail it down, because I am less sure that my opinions are correct. That I would say that all of you is physical, including your mind, and yet your mind is completely separate from your physical body. And so I don't know how to resolve that paradox. But as Christians, we're pretty good with paradoxes like that, I would think, right? We do okay with that, you know? Yes.
The person that does the emotions has a book. She also has an excellent TED Talk. So
Oh,
a little bit too, guys.
Lisa Barrett has a TED Talk. I need to go watch a TED Talk too. So,
Her name again.
Lisa Barrett, she wrote the book How We Make Emotions, and apparently she has a good TED Talk. Michelle is the queen of TED Talks. If you need like shorter, bite-sized things other than like technical cognitive manuals, talk to Michelle. Some of you may be that way. Not many of you have autism. So, we can talk about the Spirit, and this is actually my favorite part of the discussion because it might feel like common sense now that we've done all this background, but it's actually really, really hard to get people to accept that the Spirit can be very argued with fair certainty that it has all the same functions, criteria, and definition. So, is it measurable? Does it have real-world consequences? Are there physical effects? Are there mental effects? Are there benefits or costs? Benefits for contending with it and costs for not contending with it? Shouldn't that be observable in research? Does it orient you to have faith? Is that observable? I put the body and mind piece there because if you fully accept that you have a body, like in the way that you believe that your physical body is significant to the point that you take care of it. That's what I mean. Like you act as though you believe your body's important, which not all of us do. But if you act as though your body's important, you're going to engage in something that would maybe be described as hygiene. But it's going to include working out. It's going to include eating correctly. It's going to include being conscientious and mindful of it. You're going to always be watchful of it. And health, you're going to do checkups. And as I said, I doubt John MacArthur would be opposed to medical health. I just kind of doubt it. And then the mind. You know, there's an element of resilience that we want from the mind, and that requires no less focus and no less mindfulness. That if I let my mind drift, I'll become indisciplined, I'll become corrupted, and that will inevitably affect me physically and also socially and familially with the family. And there's lots of ways that can spin out no less than the body. And so we keep kind of forever in our mind or forever on our orientation. We're forever orienting ourselves to our mental health in a way or to our mind. And again, if you don't, you'll be phenomenally undisciplined really quickly. Life is hard. But will the Spirit give you the same statistical advantage as engaging with the body as though it's real and must be contended with? It's a fair question. So let's look at the effects of faith. Here's a study. I'm not going to read off all of them, but it showed the increased ability of college students to cope who became faith-believing midpoint in college. So if they came into college, struggled, kind of found their feet, worked through college, and at some point, if they became a Christian, what happened to them? And the answer was they dropped 30% lower in the anxiety correlations compared to their background population. And this is taking into a multivariate effect, including how far along they are relative to other people. So it wasn't like they just got better at college and their anxiety went down. No, they got better at college, their anxiety went down, they became a Christian, and their anxiety went down 30% more on average. I think there might be a slide on it later. Oh, there it is. Actually, it's up there right now. The Barna research showed that more than a 30% reduction in anxiety was observed across thousands of people in more than 50 countries symmetrically and consistently. So it's like, okay, so their anxiety, their mental health problems reduced because of becoming a Christian, becoming spiritualized, becoming aware of their spirit. That's a little bit interesting. And that's a change, like something that you would have to contend with. It's like, okay, this is something real. And it does need to be revisited, that if you are disoriented, that's a good way of describing someone who believes a lie. There's lots of ways to get disoriented. Now, if your faith were a lie, you would be disoriented. You would choose the wrong interventions. The interventions would have poor results, and your mental health would go down. Okay, that's not what's happening here. And we, by the way, I only picked a few. There's actually a few more slides on mental health statistics, which we will go over. But just know that there are 20,000 publications on spirituality and mental health. 20,000. I could not possibly have gone over them. When I was in a PhD program, I wanted to do a study for my dissertation on spirituality and spiritual integrations, and they said, no, we won't even let you, because you'll never get past the literature review. We actually don't want you to be here in 10 years. Because in your doctorate, you have to summarize all the relevant, similar research before you start your dissertation. And they said I would never be able to complete it, so they wouldn't let me. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Worse for you, but
Oh, okay.
Perfect. Great.
So I was wondering about that idea of if you are believing the wrong ideas, then it can have bad effects on you.
Yes.
And did they do this study specifically with Christianity, or did they, like, was it transcendental meditation? Was it other things, you know?
That's a good question. Many of the citations that I have on here are specific to Christians, and the Barna Group is a specific large research group for Christians. And there's other research groups that are quite large, dedicated just to Christianity as well. And there are many. If we're going to go this deep, which I'm totally fine with doing, we do see, and this is interesting and maybe almost philosophically like worth tearing into. But do people who have other faiths show a reduction in anxiety? And the answer is something like, and this is debatable because not all studies are comparable, but from a bird's eye view, it seems as though they do, but we see a greater reduction in mental health concerns in the Christian church. And I believe that that is the quantifiable element of the Holy Spirit. Mm-hmm. And truth. Yeah, truth. Thank you. Truth. And maybe I would also say that it is quite popular to culturally appropriate Christian values because they give us better outcomes. Just like Pat Edmonds said, it's truth as well. It is truth as well. And that truth actually is being spread around in many, many, many different ways. I won't pick on any other religion, but let's just say if you go back far enough, they didn't look so good. and that's because you can go back to the book of Leviticus where they're learning how to have hygiene before they knew what hygiene was. There's been a lot of truth packed in our faith and our religion and through our history that is way more significant and substantive than people have really spent time to think about. They wouldn't really understand the purpose of hygiene for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Louis Pasteur was like, 150 years ago? That's not that long ago. And yet, they had a very strong concept of hygiene from the book of Leviticus. And that's just truth. You could say, well, was it moral? That's up for the pastors to cover. But it definitely was truth. And that truth was appropriated quite a bit by other cultures and governments and religions, and they've all benefited from that, okay? Because there was truth, yeah.
Josh, I often thinking of that God created us to have faith, and I think that there's something, maybe it's the physical part of why placebo effect sometimes works is because of the faith of the person that is going to work.
Yes, and that's an interesting piece that makes the discussion much more complicated. And if I was doing like a lecture to mental health professionals, I would have to address the fact that we have something inside us like hope, and hope produces a temporary orienting response, and that we can go home and be better parents, and we can go home and work harder and clean up more. We can be a better employee. We can behave as though we have more truth in our life just because of hope. Now, the difference between the placebo and something real is actually quite simple. Length of time. So you fast forward 2 years and the placebo wears off and truth rises to the surface. And it takes about 2 years. Was there a question over here? Sorry, that's okay. And so that's how I would differentiate the two for those of you who are like, really want to go that deep into it. And we don't go over that in every single study on spiritual integrations, but there are some. So not that I've read all 20,000 papers, though. All right. Let's look through a few more of these. Spiritual conversion. This one actually talked about spirituality as being more significant than a coping skill. They compared the effect of coping skills in their study and other studies relative to the mental health benefits of spiritual conversion and found that it was not on par with coping, that it couldn't be this like element of hope or this element of placebo. It was way too significant of a change for it to compare with those. You wouldn't refer to physical hygiene as a coping skill, and this study actually made that contrast itself in a study and said that the effects that we're seeing on conversion to Christian faith were as significant as giving somebody who had no hygiene. It's like, okay, so if you are just as much spiritual as you are physical, and I start taking care of my physical body, that's going to have a noticeable, profound impact on my life. And it turns out, according to this study at least, that there's no less of a significant benefit of having this epiphany and realization that I am a spirit and all of me is a spirit, and that has to be contended with. And if I start contending with that appropriately, the benefits in my life become as significant as adding hygiene into a community or a culture or individual who previously had none. Yes?
In this case, you're talking about spirit. I'm just trying to see, is this Christianity as well, right? Because in Christianity, there's tenets of Christianity beyond, because there's other people, right, other religions who are saying, oh, well, I'm a spirit, I have a spirit, like,
Yes.
That believe in the spirit world. So with Christianity specifically, you could even draw it beyond just, I have a spirit, to what are the declarations of faith of a Christian?
Yes.
Right?
Well, and maybe we need like a slide that actually shows the impact of the Holy Spirit. And I really, really firmly believe that. And you can quantify. Now, that would have been maybe what I would have done my dissertation in if they let me. I'll get you in a second, don't worry. But that because there is a differential between non-Christian-based spiritual studies and Christian spiritual-based studies, you could, in theory, say, well, if the Holy Spirit is your counselor, if the Holy Spirit is changing your heart, that should also be quantifiable. And it is from what I read, okay? It is from what I read. Yes.
I just have a question. So, trailing back earlier when we were having a conversation about, it sounds like believing lies and truth and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
So I just have a general question. If someone is struggling with loneliness and suicidal thoughts, and they are reaching out for help, and let's say so-called Christians say, oh, you need to pray more, you need to believe more, you're believing a lie, or whatever, is that really healthy?
What's the question? I want to make sure I answer your question.
So we were talking
specifically
about truth and lies,
Yes.
And stuff, and we're learning how to define how that plays into what I guess we're talking about here, mental health and all that.
Yeah.
And I just have a question, just in general. If someone, let's say you have somebody who was struggling with loneliness
Yes.
to the point of suicidal thoughts,
Yes.
And they're asking for help, from the church and stuff, and all they get back is you're believing lies, you need to pray more, you need to pursue God. Is that healthy?
No, it's not healthy and it's not harmful. And I'll make it very clear to you. If I say, I feel horrible and I'm miserable, are you going to tell me that's a lie?
Well, I wouldn't.
No. But I phrased it, I'm basically cutting past the semantics and making it more clear. People are really bad at talking. We're really bad at communicating. There's actually quite a lot of translation between me having an experience me formulating that experience into words that I understand, and then trying to convey those into words that I think you'll understand, communicating those words, and then that person, aka the church, is going to interpret them based on their history of understanding and association and try to extrapolate what I mean. There's actually quite a few layers of interpretation just in two people talking. Like, we're not that good at it. We're really not that good at it. Because if you came to the church and you said, I'm miserable, I'm deeply, deeply uncomfortable, I'm having a very, very hard time telling this, I'm not sure what will happen in the future, I'm not sure what I can stand, if I can stand this very long, they're probably not going to say to you, that's a lie. What they're saying to you is something that they heard, not what you said. They're responding to something they heard, not something you said. And that's a problem. And he's like, why do you understand all this technical stuff? Well, because, I mean, that's what I do for a living. I'm a therapist. Like, a therapist's job is to try to get past all those errors, okay? Try to get past all those errors to understand what's really, really going on. That when they said something like, that's a lie, it was probably in response to what they heard you say was, I'm worthless. And they said, no, that's not true. Does that make sense? That's what they thought they were saying. That's what they thought they were communicating. That's what I think.
So that's what they thought you were communicating even if you didn't say it.
Correct. And so when they respond to what they thought you said or thought you meant, and then by the time their words were translated in your head, it was not useful and actually very harmful. And that happens a lot to everyone, all the time. Talking is very, very, very difficult. And that's part of the reason why I'm really passionate about being a therapist, despite the fact that I have a theology degree. I actually worked at a church for a while. I grew up with parents who were missionaries and pastors. But I'm a therapist. Now, I'm not belittling pastoral work. I partner with pastors a lot because some people need to be listened to a lot more carefully, and it's not always obvious who they are because we're just trying to get stuff done, you know? we got a lot of stuff to do, you know? Mm-hmm. And a therapist's job is to sit and be very, very careful. So did I answer your question correctly?
Yes, I think
Okay.
so.
Okay. You can chime in again if you have another thought, okay?
Will do. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions arise out of that one? Someday I'll actually build a lecture on how difficult communication actually is, because they said there's more steps than you think there are. It's far more steps than you think there are. And it's something like I'm having an experience, I translate that into meaning that's my meaning. I try to translate that meaning into words that I think you'll understand. I say them, okay? Then you hear them, and then you try to do the process in reverse, okay? That's complicated, okay? And also, when I use a word like a feeling word, that's not real. I mean, that is real, but it is actually real. It's real in the definition that we chose today, but it's not the same thing that you mean when you say it. Because like when I say depressed, I'm referring to my interpretation of a sensation that was formed from the association of the historical experience of that sensation. And research says that that's not the same between each person. It's just not the same. And so there's so many points where errors can occur in talking or communicating. So, So spiritual integrations. I put the Ron Swanson quote up here from Parks and Recreation. There was a point in the show, it was a silly comedic TV show, where at one point, this boss guy who works at the government, he wins an award. He actually wins Woman of the Year award, which is supposed to be kind of humorous. And the woman who wanted it, who lost to a man, which was hilarious, who didn't even want it, he's kind of joking and taking it lightly and kind of smack talking a little bit. She says, "Ron, that's not the attitude of an award winner," to which he responds, "Everything I do is the attitude of an award winner because I have won an award." I would have you all internalize that thought. Everything you do is spiritual. Everything. You don't get to pick and choose. When Christ died, the veil was torn. Between the sacred and the unsacred is gone. There's no division. Any of those divisions that we think we have, we kind of made up. That everything you do is spiritual. Everything you do is physical, or it will have physical consequences. And everything you do is of the mind. But on that thought with spirituality, if we view our lives and we actually behave as though we believe that we are all spiritual all the time, that every act is sacred, and if we actually believed that and we built our behavior to match that, it would be fascinating what might happen in our lives. We don't really, this is actually a problem. Like, I don't know if you ever think about this, maybe it's just me, but we say we believe things, but what if we actually zoomed out and said, well, what does your behavior say that you believe? I do this a lot in counseling. I say, okay, I know what you believe, I know what you say you believe, but and then they believe that in a certain relativistic way, according, maybe in a semantics way, they actually do believe what they say they believe. But what does their behavior say they believe? And you can actually look at someone's life and you get different answers sometimes. And so when I say believe, that's kind of what I'm referencing. What if we really believed in a way that informed our behavior that we were spiritual and that everything we did was sacred, for better or worse? And you don't, again, I'm a bit nerdy fellow. Like sometimes when I do college lectures, especially in the doctoral level, I'll actually put a video up on chaos theory or the butterfly effect. And it's a mathematical equation that basically shows that whether or not you believe in God, everything you do affects everything in time, which means that if anything matters at all, everything matters. And that's mathematically proven, which is a little disturbing. Everything you do matters. Everything you do is sacred. Maybe we watch little movies about like Marty McFly going back in a time machine and he changes something in the past and only one thing changes in the future. But in reality, the smallest things magnify over time. And that's mathematically more true than you probably want to explore. But it is absolutely true. Everything affects everything in time. So here we are, the mind, the body, fully integrated, back and forth. What I think, what I do with my mind, my internal disciplines, they're going to have direct correlation on my physical body. And so forth, the body is going to affect my mind completely. And then we bring in the spirit. Real world consequences, physical effects, mental effects, benefits of contending with it, consequences of not contending with it. And we're better oriented as Christians the way that someone with a body who uses hygiene or someone with a mind who practices some mental resilience has. Yes? Mm-hmm.
Like experiences or what they're feeling or what's going on.
Yeah.
Like how would you classify empathy, or how would you how would you describe empathy? Like what's happening?
That's such a good question. And I know that there is a better answer that I have to, if I answer you with any amount of confidence, I'll regret it later. Can you repeat the question one more time? Pat's here, by the way. She's smart.
Okay. So if it's true that no one can experience what you're experiencing,
Yes.
then when people have empathy or high levels of empathy,
Yes.
how do you define that? Like
What's happening there?
Yeah, what is that?
Why can we actually help each other? Why does it work? What is happening when there's empathy, which is another question. And by the way, you can measure empathy in the brain. 70% of autistic individuals are missing this empathy center. You can measure it in something called mirror neurons. 15% of the background population is missing these empathetic mirror neurons. 30% of mood disorders are missing them as well. It's a problem. Not that they're missing, they're just not working.
That common human experience.
Yes.
And we, common human experience. And I mean, like even just looking in each other's eyes,
Yes.
and when we see pain,
Yes.
we've had our pain.
Yes.
And so there's a natural response of the heart.
Yes. And it could be something like, if you zoom out far enough, if I zoom in close enough to your experience, no one in the world can really relate to your specific experience, because they'd have to have all of your experiences across your life and have all the same associations to construct your experience. But if we zoom out far enough, we're all in the same boat. And that's just as true too. I think that's what you were saying. I want to go a little bit further with it and say that Jesus is the great physician. And we do believe that, and we do witness that, and we also go to hospitals and get help.
Yeah.
So we want to tie in as much as possible. And why? Because life is that hard, okay?
Yeah.
But on top of that, not only is Jesus the great physician, but we also have Jesus in our hearts. And that's actually what John MacArthur's actually guilty of. And that's really like the most significant point of this talk, is what John MacArthur missed was that he was bordering on, I think, because I haven't looked at the full context, the just give me Jesus theology, which sounds really, really good. But the problem is, you are made to be in a community of people with Jesus.
Yeah. Yep.
And that we are all supposed to get more Jesus from each other. And that's the great physician. And I mean, again, a therapist is just someone who slows down. It's a unidimensional relationship, which is not balanced, but it's so that this person can be heard really, 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 really carefully, so that communication can be done carefully for this purpose of dissecting what's really going on with them. Yes? Yes.
And it just sounds to me like it's maybe like there's a continuum of like some people are more empathetic and some people are less, and so like it doesn't mean that you won't understand anyone at all.
Right.
You know, it's
Right.
just that it can be more or less.
Yes, I would agree. I would agree. And that it's more that we should be cautious about saying, I know what you're going through, because we're projecting when we say we're doing that. We're something inside of us is resonating, and on a large scale, if we zoom out far enough, that's the human condition and the pain that we all experience. One of the slides that we skipped over talked about how physical pain is real. It has to be contended with. It has real-world consequences. John MacArthur's probably not going to argue against physical pain, okay? But emotional pain is on the same neurotransmitter system. It's norepinephrine, okay? So if I see someone in pain, I'm going to see a certain kind of imbalance in a network in their brain. That's what I do for a living, okay? If I see someone who's in emotional pain, it's a similar kind of imbalance in the same network and the same kind of asymmetry, because it's the same neurotransmitter system that's imbalanced. So if you're experiencing emotional pain, it doesn't feel the same way to you as physical pain, but your body behaves the same, which is alarming. The consequences are measurable. The consequences are specific. And the funny thing about well, not funny, but that's fascinating that they're measurable in the exact same ways. So I can see someone who looks like they're in physical pain, and I have to ask them, do you have any chronic pain disorders of any kind? No. Did you have a bad childhood? Yes, okay. Got it. Yeah, go ahead.
I was writing down the same question that
Yes.
she had, and I guess the only thing, I know there's more to it than this, but when I think about like empathy, you know, like you were saying, it's not really saying, oh, I get it. I'm
Yes.
experiencing your exact pain.
Yes. Yes.
It's almost like this element of presence and compassion. Like my
Yes.
experiences helps me to sit with you in yours, even though I know that I can't understand your experiences completely. it's given them the space and presence
And-
and compassion. So
And I don't know, for those of you who have suffered more than you thought you could, did what you really want in that moment was to be next to somebody who actually went through the same thing? And the answer is no, that's not what you wanted. And yet, for some reason on the other side of the fence, that's the error that we tend to find ourselves making, that maybe what they want is camaraderie. No, they want support. They want a safety net. They want care. They want love. You know, a child suffering doesn't want another child suffering. They want a parent. And we forget that sometimes. Yeah.
So you said that you asked the person if they had any physical pain, and they
Yes.
said no. And you said, well, did you have a bad childhood?
Yes.
So were you implying that I guess the trauma
Yes.
that the child grew up in is manifesting physically because the body keeps the score,
Yes.
and it's a process of untangling from the trauma?
Yeah, and we have to ask, like, hey, someone's suffering. Do I have a body problem or a mental problem or a spiritual problem? Because I'm going to be able to measure it in all three. So let's say I leave here today and I get into a bad car accident and I lose my arm. I've done a lot of work with amputee patients, so it's not going to make me alarmed, you know, but that's an alarming thought to a lot of you if you lose an arm. If I lose an arm, am I going to have a physical crisis, an emotional crisis, or a spiritual crisis? All of them? Completely. All of them. Yeah. That I have to work through that. Now, God can come in and he can create restoration in many, 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 many ways, and oftentimes he does. And those of us who are going to recover from horrible, maiming accidents are going to do so the best by contending with our whole selves. That I'm going to have to face that emotional crisis, and I'm going to have to face that spiritual crisis. And that's how I'm going to recover more holistically, quickly. Does that make sense? Yes, Pat.
Under the better orientation for believers,
Mm-hmm.
you have body, hygiene, mind, resilience. What would you put for spirit? And then what?
That's a really good question. Ooh.
Can you repeat the question?
So what go you?
It'll give you thinking.
Yeah, please.
time, Josh.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, I need it. I need it.
Okay, so I noticed there on the right side of it, just above the word spirit, and you're helping us see how all of these, there's a tie, and that's why it's got to be integrated, and that a better orientation for believers with our body and realizing that the body is important. It's important to God. God created our bodies. And so there's a correlation then for taking care of our bodies. And then of the mind, of developing resilience. Okay, I want another bullet point there for the spirit.
Yeah, so for the bulletin point for the spirit, I would say that just like with the other two, it's more than one thing. You know, taking care of the body is more than hygiene. It's checkups, it's sleep, it's exercise, it is hygiene, it's also diet, it's a lot of things. And with the mind, it is actually more than resilience as well. Like we have social needs. And if you don't engage socially, those empathy centers will actually go idle, and you can see it in the brain. I can actually tell when somebody has not been getting out enough with friends. If they stay in their little family pod and they never get out, I can see that in their brain. And guess what? It went up in everybody during COVID. Every single one of them. Every single brain map I did during COVID was understimulated socially. And there's a cost to that. But just with spirituality, it's not just one thing. We just gave one example with these, and we're not going to give one example for spirituality, but like we are made for the church. We are made for each other. Okay? And there's supposed to be a reciprocal relationship there where I need as much Jesus as I can get, and some of that has to come from you. Okay? And again, that's what John MacArthur might be missing, is the fact that we're not supposed to be give me Jesus only, that we are part of that plan, that the church is part of that body. We are made for each other. And within that, we should have things like fellowship. We should have things like service. We should have things like sacraments, church. And the list could, I could give the mic to her and she could finish that off, because that could go for a while. There's a lot. If you could have someone come up and talk about hygiene, not just hygiene, but like how do you take care of the body? There's thousands, if not millions of hours of lecture on that. And we have just as much depthness and content and concern with how we take care of the spirit. Yes?
Is this where soul care would come in?
Soul care.
And like taking care of the soul and the healing journey that ensues, as you're recognizing, oh, these are integrated, and I do need to also connect with that part of myself, my heart. Where would the soul fit into that?
Yeah. So I as I said, it can be hard to differentiate the mind and the soul, but I do believe they behave as separate entities. And there are different practices for each one, I believe. They are fully integrated, and so there's always going to be mind effects, mental effects, whenever we engage in spiritual things. You're like, oh, well, my emotional systems can get quite engaged at church. Is that spirituality? The answer is, all of you is spiritual, and all of you is mental. And so we always see this interplay between them. If we were to measure your endorphin levels during a really moving church service, those will be moving too, and that's the body. And so we have a very hard time separating them, but we know they're separate. And part of the reason why I know they're separate is because we're going to go without the body for a while someday. We're going to be without it. And the Bible says that it's not good to be without the body. We're waiting for a new heaven and a new earth. There's going to be a period of separation where we'll be better because we're with Christ, but we won't be whole until the day of the Lord. And, so we're going to be missing part of ourselves. That's okay. The glorified state. Yeah, we're waiting for completion. This is fascinating because you are kind of complete now, but you're also very broken. So, which is disturbing. That's a whole nother hour. We're not going to get into that. Let's see here. So we talked about this a little bit already, but John MacArthur, perhaps forgetting that we are little Christs, forgetting that we are Christ's ambassadors on earth, and that we are supposed to be the hands and feet of Christ, both out to the world and to each other, and that's a significant part about how we get more Jesus in our lives is through each other. And I'd love to have a conversation with him about what he may have actually meant, because I like to view people generously. That seems very hard to come up with what that may be. But I'd love to ask about that portion of it, because I do believe that therapists are a very new phenomenon, and it's essentially just someone who's specializing in a single-sided relationship for the purpose of listening so carefully that we don't make errors in communication. And then you add skills and disciplines on top of that to do it better, and that there are people who benefit from that, which is good, because we don't have enough time and we don't have enough clarity of thought to realize, and we also have so many things pending that we need our attention from when somebody needs that. And if you could read everybody's mind, we wouldn't have therapists. But we can't. So I've got more slides, by the way. How much time do we have, by the way? Perfect. So we still have 45 minutes. I've got like a whole nother thing to open up if we have more time. So it sounds like we can go into it, which is kind of interesting. We're going to talk about the new problems in the church and how mental health is still. We still have work to do. As advantaged as we are, we still have work to do. And I'd like to ask this question. I've done this a number of times at a number of churches, but when should the young people in our church get married? Just as a general idea. Does anybody have any opinions? When's the best time to get married? When they're ready. It's a mature audience answer. It's complicated. When are people generally ready, or when should they be ready? Mid-20s, yeah, like 24, 25, 26. Yep, yep. That's probably the most common answer that I get, by the way. And there is no wrong answer. This isn't a head fake. I'm not tricking you. I honestly mean that. There is a problem, but it's not with your answer, okay? When do people in this audience get married? Now, normally I would move these bulletin points in one by one, but we're not going to do that. But when did you guys get married? Did anybody get married, say their first marriage was after the age of 40? You can raise your hands if you had. So we got a couple. We got one, two, yeah. How about in their 30s? Who got married for the first time in their 30s or marriage? There you go, we got 3 or 4. How about after the age of 25? Okay, and before the age of 25? More. So most of you got married before the age of 25. Okay. I'm curious if anybody who had the youngest marriage? I'm just curious. 1920? Yeah. Okay, wow. Yeah. Oh, what was that? 18, yes. Now, I'm not advocating for anything. We're not going in that direction, okay? It's just fascinating. When you have like a big church, there's always some sweet 90-year-old couple in the back that's been married since they were 15 or 16. It always happens. And this is worth looking at because the age of puberty has been dropping 6 months every 10 years for the last 150 years. You can do the math on that. It's a little disturbing. Now, we know why. Okay, we know why, but the age of puberty has been going back and back and back and back. And some of you know this because, or some of you have noticed this because if you look at textbooks, it's like, oh, the average of puberty is like 10, 11? I thought it was 13, I thought it was 12. And it depends on when you went to high school, when you went to grade school. Go back to old textbooks and the age ranges are later. And so the age of puberty is getting earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier. What is it right now? I don't know, 10 to 11? Yeah, I was like, I think like, more like 11 and a half to 12 when I was in, grade school or high school. I remember that from the textbook. I remember noticing it was different, going, why is it different? Is there like not a consensus? But it's because it's changing. It's changing because of 5 things, okay? More food, so we have physically more food. Quality of food. Hormones in the food. Light exposure, LEDs. LEDs are more stimulating than incandescents, and incandescents don't exist anymore. And then sexual exposure to content, okay? The age of puberty does cap out no earlier than 8 years old, as long as you aren't sexually abused. So that's where it's going to end up, probably. That's where researchers think it'll end up is about 8. So when we think about when did we hit puberty versus when did we get married, if you go back 4 generations, they actually were starting to get married around the same time that they hit puberty. If you go back 5 generations, they were getting married before the age of puberty. That's not crazy long. Like, you've met some of them. Some of you have met some of them. That's not a long time ago, And so you go back more than 100 years, and we end up observing that across human history, most cultures paired off before they hit puberty. For thousands of years, that was the norm. And all of a sudden, in the last 100 years, and more like in the last 50 to 60 years, people are starting to wait. Now, I'm not proposing anything. I'm just raising your awareness to a problem. Not a problem we can solve, but a problem. And it might help us be empathetic. Because it's a problem. Okay, it's difficult. Like, what do you do about this? How long did we wait? How long did my parents wait? How long did my grandparents wait? My great-grandparents probably got married around the same time they hit puberty. My grandparents probably waited 2 or 3 years. My parents probably waited 5 or 6 years. I probably waited 10. Our kids are waiting 15, 16, 17. 17 years? 30-some years? Well, if it caps out at 8, and we say the average age is going to be about 24, 25, that'll be about 17 years. But it could be longer. Oh, for you personally. Ah, yes. Yeah. Gosh, sorry, I'm dull. It's a long time. And I worry about mental health in the church. I worry about our ability to listen to each other and have empathy. I worry about what will happen if we don't acknowledge this as a new problem, that we act as though it's old, we act as though it's always been this way. Maybe it has in your relative experience, but the church doesn't have thousands of years of defenses against this. We don't. We don't have systems that have been built over hundreds or thousands of years. We don't have that. We're just now starting to talk about it. What do we do about it? I don't know. This is difficult. The therapist is stumped. That's a problem. Go ahead. Yeah, yeah, context, ouch. Yeah, don't worry. Yeah, and then when Paul says it is better to be married than to burn with passion, that's difficult because they are all having to wait and to burn with passion. And we don't have a solution for that. We can't get people married off at 10. It's not the answer, okay? So what do we do? Do we normalize early births? Well, there's cost to that I'm not saying we want to pay. But we have the need for a phenomenal fortitude is needed mentally and spiritually, and probably even physically, because it helps tie everything else together, for the church to be really separate and set apart. And I didn't put the statistics in here because it probably would hurt me too much to do so. But maybe I'll go over them verbally because I have them in my head. But large Barna studies have shown across thousands and thousands and thousands of people, tens of thousands of people surveyed in the church. And the issues around pornography, which is just one dimension that we could measure, there's many, many things that we can measure, showed consistent struggle measured by weekly or monthly use with 77% of the church congregation. And 40% of them are female. So that's much higher than you expect. It sounds more like a frat house, you know? It's a problem. With more than 30% of the church worrying that they're addicted. And again, that number would go up if they tried to abstain. Because they would realize, oh no, I am addicted. And so we have some big problems with not being set apart in the ways that we're supposed to be set apart. We are very, very distinct in research, which is great. But we have areas that we have a shadow, we have a blind spot, and we haven't resolved them, and we haven't talked about this new problem in the church, and we don't know how to solve it. And we're not seeing, I think it was a different study showed 36 to 50% struggled with an affair. And it's like, okay, so we have a high rate of affairs in the church as well, that the things that pull us together, that connect us, that bind us, have been broken apart and been shaky, which is understandable if you think about the neurodevelopmental effects of this waiting period. Okay, now if I, hit puberty at 16 or 17, which was the typical age for thousands of years, and you can tell that because of all kinds of really interesting studies with like pharaohs and things like that. We see them getting married around 12, 13. Several years later, they start having kids. When they finally have that, they consummate that marriage, which is why we separated them. Marriage and consummation is separate because there could be a gap between them. That was the first and only experience they had. There's actually something that happens in the brain that's like pseudo-epileptic in the frontal lobe. And it's a perturbation of the frontal lobe that causes the brain to have to rewire itself quickly and radically. And we see in research that if somebody stumbles onto the internet, usually around the age of 8 is the average time, and they get exposed to something sexual, something very explicitly sexual, the effect is that will be predictive of their future preferences that first time. Yeah, and there's a lot of weird stuff on the internet, and it gets weirder because then that generation grows up and puts more content on the internet, which makes it even weirder for the next generation, and so on and so forth. And it gets more diseased, and there's less order, there's less things tying us together. The thing that's supposed to orient the couple is a single individual that we're mapped to. It's very hard to cheat on that person when your ideal is a person, and you live with them, and your brain is shaped to them, because it had this perturbation mechanism that stirred it up and mapped you to that person. I don't know how to get back there. So God made a system that's beautiful, and because of the way that our culture's laid out, we can't participate in it in the way that we're supposed to. Even though we're already broken, we're not even using what we're supposed to use. And I don't know what to do about that. So we have some big challenges ahead. And it's not obvious how to tackle those. But maybe the first thing we should do is acknowledge the problem. That's always the most important thing, is acknowledge what the problem really is. Hopefully that'll lead to more empathy, more support, and eventually better ideas. So, another thought that I have is that I also believe, and this is another topic change, but I believe that there's a potential sanitization from, we'll say, Christian values, maybe not the values, but the Christian presence within mental health. A lot of people, if you're studied in mental health, you might argue with me on this one, that's fine. But I do believe that there is a strong Christian influence in the early stages of mental health. I'm not going to say Freud. No one who studied Freud likes Freud. Freud basically was naming the disorders that he had. That is true. I'm not going to get into that, but it's more true than people know. It's very, very disturbing. But after Freud, there were many positive Christian influences, and some of them were not perfect, and some of them may not have been faith-based all the time, which is why it's easy to argue against it. But I personally believe that Carl Jung at least ended his life as a Christian. And not everybody believes that, because if you look at the entire scope of his practice, he did a lot of weird things and he said a lot of weird things. And it's like, yeah, some of us did too. And we might be better now. And I think that that's potentially true about Carl Jung, someone who learned how to read fluent Koine Greek and ancient Hebrew, and taught and built existential psychology, building in and pulling in the purpose and meaning as being an essential part of working in mental health, essentially acknowledging we have to have the spiritual. And some of the contexts that make him look at the end of his life like he may have been actually a Christian, at least by the end of his life, are seen only in texts that I could find that were translated from German, that I can't find them in our local universities. Yeah, imagine that. It's a little disturbing. As someone who taught at several universities and have been in school for half my life, all of my mentors and all of my professors urged me to say, no, Jung couldn't have been a Christian. There's no way. And that it seems so certain. But the more I dig, the less certain I am that he wasn't a Christian. And the more evidence that he was, I see. And it took me a while to find this, but I'll show it just because it's interesting. It may not actually show it because of the context. Actually, I don't think it will. I had a video that I was going to show you where he was being interviewed 2 years before his death. And he talked about the faith of his childhood being Swiss Reformed Baptist. And he would light up when he talked about it. And the interviewer at one point said, "Are you still a believer?" And he said, "Believe? Oh, no, I know. I don't believe, I know." I know, which is a different answer than maybe you got in the middle of his career, where he'd be maybe highly philosophical and a little bit too heady. And I think we can see the same thing with other psychologists that are out in the big name. Like I would actually name Jordan Peterson as somebody who seems to have come to faith in the last year. That's a big deal. He's somebody who is extraordinarily heady, talked like a Christian, but technically probably wasn't, didn't have the actual Holy Spirit. And then he almost died. And something changed. Someone named Jonathan Paggio seems to have brought him to the Lord. And I think that's really beautiful. And I love that there's such a impression on mental health from faith that these people who look like they're Christians eventually figure it out. And that there are people actually that look like they're Christians because that truth is so useful for helping people. And that's another piece that's fascinating. It's like, how much more powerful would it be if we added the actual Holy Spirit into the mix? And we do need to do that. So I'll leave some things here. And if you guys want the slides, you're welcome to email me. I'll put the email up at the end and you can ask me and I'll just text and send them off to you. There's lots and lots of citations. But here's some details on things that I found about Carl Jung that I thought were very interesting. And so the rest of the time we have is for questions. Yes?
I have a question. More because I'm curious, and we might tackle this in the panel too, but I think, how would you kind of address the fear of acknowledging mental health concerns within the church? So like, individually and collectively, because I think there are reasons why it's hard for people to bring that to us as pastors, because we haven't handled it super well in the past. But from a personal perspective, when somebody's struggling with anxiety or depression, or they're like, I can't get out of bed in the morning, I feel hopeless, I'm suicidal, what is your thought on like the wall that's there that's preventing them from?
I have two thoughts on that,
Okay.
and I don't want to forget either of them. So I'm going to say the more complex one first, and then you might have to repeat your question to jog my memory on the second, okay? The first is that part of the reason why I'm a Christian, and there was a period of my life where I was trying to sort it all out, long time ago, young adult. Part of the reason why I'm a Christian is because, this is going to sound a little bit weird, and I'm into data, okay? I'm into what's the differential, what stands out. We are much harder on the church than we are on other systems. And that seems self-evident when I say that, but just stop and think about it for a second. I was working with somebody who had been deeply wounded by the church, a YWAM program, and her pain was 100% valid, and her experiences were horrible, and it was just a bunch of naive, silly people who thought that most of leadership was kind of projecting confidence or something, and then making decisions, and in doing so, they left a little bit of a wrecking ball in this person's life. One prediction I made in this person's bitterness towards the church was that her university that she was heading off to would treat her much worse. And it didn't take her about 3 weeks to figure that out. And the interesting thing is that there isn't a bitterness towards the university who was worse. And that's a dynamic that fascinates me, actually, because you could say, well, this is a spiritual war, or maybe the way I lean towards it is, I'm really grateful that we can hold Christians to such a high standard, and I would love to figure out how to get there. like that we can be held to a higher standard. It's evident that we were, and that's part of what drove me into like a more permanent faith and out of uncertainty was the criticism was unyielding towards the church. And I thought, that's really an outlier. I don't know what that differential means, but I was fixated on it when I was young. Why are we so much harder on the church? Because they are humans, and they are making human mistakes. And if we really zoom out objectively, which is hard to do, the other systems do it too. Now, I don't want to make that as an excuse, which is it's spiritual warfare and we have more opposing us. Okay, that might be true, but I find it to be a more productive orientation to say, yes, I love that we can be held to a higher standard. Let's figure out how to get there. So that was the first half. The second, what was your question again?
So my question was addressing that like personal fear or hesitation in sharing that you are struggling with your mental health. So how do we help bridge the gap with that?
So this is the trickiest part. There is no such thing as intimacy without vulnerability. And there's supposed to be a lot of intimacy in the church, which means there has to be vulnerability. That's difficult. We're not good at that as a culture. In fact, most of our disorders that we experience are static disorders where the nervous system is stuck. And it's stuck because we have enough. And so we are prone not towards unstable disorders as a culture, but we're prone towards static disorders where something that should be mitigated through perturbation, sorry, I'm being technical in neuroscience, isn't. Because we're actually quite comfortable. And we're so comfortable that we aren't forced into vulnerability all the time, and so we have less intimacy, because that's an essential backbone ingredient of intimacy. It might be the only thing that intimacy is vulnerability. And I don't know what to do with that, because we don't have to be vulnerable. Yeah. So I mean, that's difficult. You have to have that in your mind in order to do something about it. And even then, people don't have to do it.
And what do we expect of our leaders?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. I recently spoke with a person who quite confused in what they believe and I think feel justified in their judgment of the church.
Sure.
And growing up, so then what they related to me about the church that they grew up in was that the church was to have an altar call every single Sunday. That was the pastor's job.
Okay.
Now, can you imagine what that would put a pastor to motivate people coming forward to the altar every single Sunday?
A call to vulnerability
And then but to
the people.
position himself
Yes. Yeah.
as being, above
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
all out
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
But speaking, and then this individual, because of choices in her life that were very against what her family and church taught, of course, under that kind of pressure and feeling judged, but feeling shame, and then you talk of how when we live
Missteps.
with
Yeah.
this,
Yes.
when we live with this for decades, where do we end up? And how do we find our way back home?
Yeah. It's complicated
Yeah.
because vulnerability is not always responded to correctly. And as a culture, I won't go into the research on this, but we are losing our resilience to poorly handled vulnerability, which means that we can leave too easily and say, well, that was a bad experience, I'm out. And so nobody learns anything.
Yeah.
And that's actually a big problem because the success rate of someone being vulnerable and that vulnerability becoming intimacy instead of a wound has to be higher because people leave quicker. And there's actual ways to measure that. I'm skipping the studies, but it's actually really disturbing that we have a lower mind resilience to disappointment and to frustration. I actually had a case recently where we'll say there's a misunderstanding. I'm kind of speaking generally. But there's a misunderstanding with a client. And the good thing where all the good stuff happens is for them to come back and go, when you said this, I felt horrible. I felt this way. I experienced what you said as this. And then for me to be vulnerable in return and allow myself to be wrong or critiqued and humbled, and then there's a deeper bond after that. And we don't do that as much as we used to. The amount of interaction when vulnerability doesn't become intimacy is decreasing, that our culture is becoming less and less resilient to a complex relationship. And again, we can't do much about that. We can only fix that in ourselves. Yeah.
So maybe I misunderstood what you said, but if we are crying out, because she had mentioned if we're depressed and we're suicidal and we're really crying out for change, doesn't that almost like require us to be vulnerable and transparent?
Absolutely, but it doesn't always require the person that you're crying out to be vulnerable, and they
to respond to you
right.
the same way, you mean?
Right. Well, and part of it is if there's a back and forth, if it's messy, which relationships can be messy because communication is very complicated, the back and forth really reveals who people really are. It isn't in a misunderstanding that people show who they really are. It's in the back and forth that we realize who they really are. But the back and forth is reducing in our culture. We're seeing people engage when they're disappointed less and less and less. And again, it's not obvious what to do about that because that's a cultural thing. It's not something that we can choose for it to be different.
But you were implying like within the church culture or within the church atmosphere.
Yeah, well,
So
this is going to sound weird, and I actually ran into this a little while ago. I won't say where or who, but I was given the opportunity. That's not true. I was voluntold to build a ministry program. Sorry, I was in the military. I was voluntold a pastor came to me and said, "You're going to build a men's program for the church." And I was like, "I am?" He says, "Yes, you are. You're going to be here on Thursday night, and you're going to have a team, and you're going to build it." I was like, "Oh, okay. I guess I'm building a ministry program." I came home and told my wife. She says, "You volunteered for that?" No, I didn't. So we built out this beautiful men's program, and more men showed up than there was even members of the church. So it was a very large response. And the agreement with the ministry team was that the pastors were not going to be involved and they weren't going to speak, that we were going to have to do it. And I was hoping for it to be raw and uncomfortable and awkward. That's what I wanted. And at the last second, 5 minutes before it started, I found out that the speaker had replaced himself with the pastor, who promised he wouldn't. I was very disappointed, because it has to start with the leadership. And it's hard, because how do you ask someone who speaks for a living to be vulnerable? I'm not that vulnerable up here. Like, it's a little hard because it's been a couple years, but this isn't that hard for me. So what is it going to take for me to do something that's actually hard? And the thing is, we don't have to do it. We don't have to. We do sometimes. We get up and we do things that are uncomfortable. But it's very, very hard to choose to be vulnerable. And a lot of times when we're in a position of leadership, people are coming to us far more vulnerable than we are with our community.
So what you're saying then is that we don't have to put ourselves in a position to be vulnerable with people if we don't want to. And then secondly, secondly, that within the church, they should be the ones that we can go to and help problem solve.
Yes, and we have to figure out how to, it's weird because I'm speaking with a pastor over here, so I'm not trying to call you out. But in general, I believe that we need to, as leaders, demand that we each other are vulnerable, that we have to try and be more vulnerable far more often. And we have to put ourselves in uncomfortable situations, and we have to figure out how to be more honest. And we're also under fire more, which makes it even harder. It makes it easier to clam up and stay in our comfort zone. And just because we're up here speaking doesn't mean we're outside of our comfort zone. That's the problem. And so I knew in this situation that this pastor was going to just, this is his sweet spot, was up there speaking. But I wanted it to be somebody who I had never done it before. And the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of men that slammed full the church, like they were all standing in the back, way over fire code capacity, that they would have been better seeing somebody vulnerable, because it was a sermon on vulnerability. So yeah.
So it's community.
Yes.
And fellowship, and then developing relationships where you can then unfold.
And we only get relationships because of intimacy, and we only get intimacy because of vulnerability. And we can't, as leaders, expect everybody to come to us with that vulnerability. We have to be able to provide it ourselves. And again, we don't even know how to encourage people to do that. It's very hard. This is asking a lot. Yeah.
I would say that, so just thinking about what you're talking about like vulnerability and intimacy. And, in Scripture we have the context of covenant that goes with that. And I think that is really where, sorry, this isn't a question, but
you're good.
Just to speak to the topic, that in the church and like as a culture, we haven't really learned, I think, the extent that covenant matters to God.
Yeah.
And the extent of let your yes be yes, your no, no. And if I know that you are for me, if I know that I'm in a safe place, if I know that you are committed to a certain level, then it's going to be much easier for me to be vulnerable, because I know that you're not just here today and gone tomorrow.
Yeah.
You're not just passing through. You're actually like there's a commitment there.
And you know how they get there, because they've been through worse, and they've done more. So they say there's lots of things. I was a soldier, and I spent 18 months in combat school, which is way too long. It's the only way to get longer time in combat school is to actually go be special forces. So this is not fun, okay? But there's no prejudices in a foxhole. Okay, that's an old saying. We all bleed green in the Army, okay, that if you have enough vulnerability, you figure everything out really quickly. And you know you can rely on that person partially because you've relied on them for bigger things. And so it's that history, that context of interpretation, that association across time, knowing that we've been through bigger things, we've held more vulnerable things than what I'm bringing to you now. That makes it easy. That makes it intimacy becomes cheap and quick now. Yes.
A number of years ago, I was a deacon at a church, and there was going to be a possible church split. Well, the Holy Spirit, he tapped me on the shoulder and said that I want you're going to be in the men's ministry. And one of the leaders came up, the elders, and they said, okay, here it is, put it together. And what I felt the Lord saying to me was, Roger, I want you to put together a men's prayer retreat, specifically men's. And we had, like 23 guys come out, and I wasn't a speaker, but I was a singer, so I did the singing and, that. And there were guys, we had no agenda, just to seek the Lord for 3 days.
Yeah.
And after that, guys were weeping
Yes.
that had been in that church for 50 years.
Yeah.
And I was just doing what the Lord wanted me to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And the Lord will put us in places where we're vulnerable, and we don't know that that's what we need. We don't know that that's how we get all the best things in life. The things that are the most real in your life all come from vulnerability.
Maybe you just answered my question.
Okay, sorry.
I have 2 teenage boys, and my question is, like, I've been really genuine and vulnerable to them, probably more than I would think would be healthy, but they amaze me at the things that they do and the way they are, even how I haven't always demonstrated my spirituality to them the best way, but I don't know, they're leaders, they're resilient, but they blow me away at their love for God, and I have not always demonstrated that, but I'm just saying, is that partly because of my vulnerability as a parent?
Yeah. Yes. There's a difference between being vulnerable with your teenagers and using them for using them in an unhealthy way. Michelle probably could articulate that better than me.
Like the emotional,
yeah.
I'm blanking on the word. There's a word. Codependency, parentifying the child.
Confusion of roles, or it's hard to tap into my head of all the disordered stuff because it's a deep well. But there isn't a problem with being vulnerable with your teenagers. In fact, what I would say is that sometimes we're afraid of being vulnerable with our teenagers because their internal system is so chaotic and they're so unstable in terms of who they are that they might be in a weird place at that moment where they'll take the advantage of your vulnerability as an opportunity to jab you in a weak spot. Because that's what vulnerable means. It comes from the Latin to be woundable. And they might take that and wound you. But this is actually what it means to be the parent. That we come back and say, hey, I was putting something out there and I was vulnerable and you hurt me. And you're actually doubling your bet at that point. and they get to either wound you again or they get to go like, yeah, that wasn't cool of me. I didn't like who I was in that moment. I wish I hadn't done that. And you can go like, yeah, I'm a parent. I can get over it. I just wanted to talk about it, and I wanted you to know how that felt, just in case other people experience that from you. You're giving them feedback about the world, and using yourself as that canvas. You can do that. You're allowed to. That's not unhealthy. You're actually doing it for them, and you're putting yourself in the most I would say you're putting yourself in a position that isn't often modeled how to do it correctly, but you can parent using vulnerability. And the difference between that and something unhealthy is where you're trying to get something from them for you, and it's not for their best outcome or best interest. Does that make sense? And even if you do, that doesn't mean you can't repurpose and fix it. There's an old Christian therapist Gary Landreth, You know who I'm talking about. Sorry, no, Gary. What's his name? Gary Landis? Okay, yeah, Gary Landis. Yeah. It's not about what you do, it's about what you do after what you have done. There you go. Pat knows what I'm talking about. That's Pat's specialty. Yes. You're good. Yeah. 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 The answer to both is yes. And this is a problem because we are a mind 100%. We are a body 100%. We are a spirit 100%. We can interact with all three of those to influence any problem within any three. Okay? So I can't necessarily fix my body, but I can become more spiritual. and that can help. Okay? And maybe I would have been better to be more spiritual from the get-go anyways. But if we can't fix one of the dimensions, like physical or mental, maybe we can lean into something else. I would say that medications do cover things up. There was a meta-analysis on SSRI, antidepressants, things that work on serotonin back in 2020. And they did spinal taps to say, okay, we're going to correct this chemical imbalance with antidepressants, and we're going to look at different groups and do a multivariate meta-analysis. And what it showed was basically people who responded to the antidepressants, they were not low in serotonin. So we were giving them something that raised serotonin levels, but they weren't actually low in serotonin. I was like, what does that mean? Well, it means that we're not correcting a physical problem here, at least not the physical problem. We are engaging in something that I like to call a perturbation effect, which means we're changing something that has a lot of strings attached to it, and it changes the equation enough that some good things come out of that. And a lot of medicine is that. A lot of mental health medicine is that, because we don't really know what we're doing. You know? Now, I actually look at brain maps of brains, and we actually are trying to hone in what is the mechanism of action for the thing that you're calling anxiety. Do you think there's only one thing that causes anxiety? No, there's dozens. When I look at people's brains electrically, there's really classic neuromarkers for anxiety, but there's lots of them. And the mechanism speaks to genetics, and it speaks to childhood experiences. Different mechanisms will lean different ways. We call those phenotypes. So I can actually look at someone's brain and go, oh, you have anxiety that looks like it's genetic based, or you have anxiety that looks like it's developmental, or you have anxiety that looks like pain. Okay? It's like, it tells me a hint about what's really going on. Not that I understand their experience, not that I know exactly what they mean when they say anxiety, but that we can cut past all the confusing language that is talking and try to get to what's the mechanism of action in your nervous system, what's the elephant in the room that's imbalanced. And sometimes we're trying to cover it up and mask it, but then we want to dig. So if I give you a tool that helps you temporarily feel better, but it's not going to work for more than 2 years, I better use those 2 years wisely. I better be a steward of that time. So if I can help somebody temporarily, I want to bolster them like I've given them some crutches, and then say, let's go do physical therapy. Let's use all this extra energy to go look deeper and try to pull out the infection while we have the energy. So I hope that answered your question. Okay. Yes?
One thing that I've noticed about, like, especially with like bigger churches, is that like if you have so many people in a congregation, it's really hard to be available to everyone, especially a pastor. Yeah. Hence having leaders, right, so that they're available too. But then it just made me wonder, well, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean all these leaders or even pastors, they're trained to be vulnerable, or even just nowadays how we're losing that vulnerability. So like, especially with you being a therapist and like trying to help people be more vulnerable to you, like what advice would you have, or how do you approach it to be vulnerable, especially to like encourage people to talk to you?
So one of the easiest way to get someone to be vulnerable with you, one, you're in a context where vulnerability is is kind of set aside. It's a sacred space almost where vulnerability is offered. If I offer my own vulnerability, which can be really hard to even know how to do, because I'm pretty comfortable in my own office and my own chair, you know, that's pretty hard to do. But if I can succeed even 10%, they'll take that and they'll open up. And it's not always obvious how to do that. It's like, this is like leaders, like, we're in our domain, we're in our space. How am I gonna, how do I do that, you know? It can be really hard. And I think I think it's like, it's something like the need to never get too complacent or too comfortable. And so I don't know the answer to your question, but that I can kind of feel out that there's supposed to be an answer like that, you know? Go ahead.
So I was feeling this earlier. But I think that I remember hearing a well-known leader, we were in a staff meeting, and he said, I just had a panic attack this week. And I was shocked because I'd never heard a well-known leader actually say that be that vulnerable. And what it made me realize is I think pastors and leaders especially can sometimes get stuck in spirit and forget that it's the Romans 7 man and the Romans 8 man, where we have this struggle we're constantly in, but we lean Romans 8 because that's truth, but Romans 7 is still there, that there's this back and forth. And I think because people are looking to pastors and leaders to be the strong answer, to be the encouragement, to be the wisdom and the strength, that pastors kind of get pushed into that space, and they actually have to fight to stay vulnerable. And I'm thinking about Jesus when he said, my soul is troubled, but what am I going to say? And there's this moment where Jesus is like the most vulnerable person in the room. He allowed himself to be vulnerable, but he came with a spiritual answer. And so I think that it's a beautiful dichotomy. And I think that the church is actually starting to open up right now and be more vulnerable. It's going to take some time, but I'm really grateful for everything today that you have released, because I think this is going to be a catalyst, especially not just for this church and this house, but multiple churches in this region. And so thank you for opening up the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. Yeah, we've got time for probably one or two more.
Okay,
and
thank
then,
you.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about just like the body of Christ, and I don't know, sometimes I know it's good like to have leaders and that kind of stuff, but I think sometimes there's like this blaming, you know, like I think of like the apostles, prophets, pastors, teachers, and all that. And I know we're all in different places and we need leaders and mentors and that kind of stuff, but like I like to look at it less like that hierarchy, you know, and so that it's not so like where leaders are like over here not really being able to be vulnerable because who's covering them, and, you know, we're blaming the leaders, you know. And I mean, I guess like if we're all leading in our own parts of the body as wherever we are in our health journey, helps us to feel connected and not have offense, because, you know, that we know our leaders have their vulnerabilities too, you know. But like, I don't know, order with ease and having connection there versus you don't open up in a men's group when you know the person is you know, is closed off and you've got them on a hierarchy versus they're just functioning in their part of the body.
Yeah, I have to add, you know, to that a thought. I do a lot of men's group stuff. I had a men's group, and it was, again, on vulnerability. I love talking about vulnerability. It's a common topic. And you guys kind of got there on your own. You drugged me there, which is great, because I'll talk about vulnerability anytime. But we had a discussion in a men's group on vulnerability. It was the first time the group was meeting. There was like, I think it was 10 guys. And we're talking about like karate instructors, truck drivers, electricians, plumbers, like just salt of the earth kind of guys. And our group was audited by the Q Center. And they sent 2 women to sit in our men's group to see what we would do. And they were wearing dresses and makeup and long hair. It wasn't anything complicated. It was women saying, we're men and we're coming to your men's group. And they were as feminine as you could possibly imagine. And I'm sitting here going like, well, this is going to be interesting because I've got a whole bunch of men that are meeting for the first time that are truck drivers and electricians and plumbers. And within the first 5 minutes, somebody, not the leader, not me, said, I just got diagnosed with a terminal illness, and I have 6 months to live. And it just didn't matter. That detail it just didn't matter. Like there was something that was so vulnerable that was offered to this group that brought the group together like soldiers in a foxhole. They had some greater purpose and meaning that washed out all the complex stuff. And we don't know how to put ourselves at that level of vulnerability because we're good at hiding the ill, we're good at hiding the elderly. You know, we're not exposed to as many deaths as we are births. You know, like we're not a very vulnerable culture. And I don't know how to change that, but we could, in theory, at least change it in our own lives. We could take more vulnerable tasks. We could say yes to things. We could pray for God to give us his adventures, which is the most risky prayer you could make. I'm not saying that facetiously. It's just a genuine, real thing. And that vulnerability affects everything in time. So.
That's really good. Israel, did you have a question? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Awesome. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. And so now this has helped me shift a little my mindset and how I continue to work with my life. Yeah. Thank you. I know that as a culture we're decent at acknowledging the needs of the body and the needs of the mind, but the spiritual piece is absent so much that it shows black and white in research. Maybe once a year or so, I have a family that comes in and said, we hear you're really good at research. We hear you're really technical. I said, yeah. They go, what's the one thing we can do for our kids that would have the most significant impact? And there is a straight answer on that. Black and white, 100%, take your kids to church. And that is the researched answer. You do not have to have a faith in God. That is the answer. That is what has the best impact on their upbringing. End of story. It outweighs everything else by a wide margin. And you can't argue with it. It's a big study. It's a good study. And that is the answer. And I'm not, trying to be pushy as a clinician, but it's the answer. That's what we're missing in our culture. So.
Wow. First of all, thank you both. I know we're going to hear more from them over the next couple of weeks. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Please give him a big clap. I think he'll be out for a little bit, maybe. Yeah. He's got lots of resources out there. We will send the slides if you're okay with that. We can send it as just a mass email. Then you don't have to worry about a million emails. Thank you all for coming. If you have questions after today, write them down and bring them next week. We're trying to give lots of time for Q&A because this is where your heart's at. Your heart's in your questions. And so we want to be able to provide time for that as much as we can. So we will see you next week at 1:30. If you did happen to bring any food or trash, please make sure to take it out with you. That just helps with our cleanup. And we'll be out in the front for a little bit, able to answer questions. But thank you again, Josh. Thank you.